My name is Harold Deansmore. I'm 79 years old and live alone in a modest cottage just outside Beaufort, South Carolina. The house is small, with chipped blue shutters and a warped wooden porch, but it's mine. It sits on the edge of a quiet marsh, where I can hear the frogs croak at night and the cicadas drone during long, humid afternoons. I've lived here since my wife, Doris, died, 10 years ago this October. People say time makes grief easier, that it dulls the edges, softens the blow. But for me, the silence has only grown louder with the years. Some mornings I wake up still expecting to hear her humming in the kitchen or clattering around with the coffee mugs. The sound never comes. Instead, I fill the silence with old habits. 2 boiled eggs for breakfast, 1 slice of toast, and a thermos of weak tea that I carry out onto the porch. I sit there in my bathrobe, looking out over the marsh, and I listen. To nothing in particular, just the world continuing without me. I wasn't always alone. I used to teach high school American history, 38 years in the classroom, mostly at Beaufort High. Kids never cared much for dates or dusty names, but I always tried to make it human, make them feel the tragedy in Gettysburg or the desperation of the Dust Bowl. After I retired, Doris and I traveled a little. Savannah, Charleston, Asheville. She liked antique shops and old graveyards, places with stories carved into stone. When she passed, I stopped going anywhere. I had friends once, but they moved or died or stopped calling when I didn't return messages. I don't blame them. I wasn't good company for a long time. I have one daughter, Melissa. She's 48 now, works as a dental hygienist in Jacksonville, married to a man named Mark Granger. He's about my age, or maybe a few years younger, but there's something slippery about him. I've never liked Mark. Too smooth, too good with his hands in his pockets, too quick with a joke that cuts. But Doris insisted I try. For Melissa's sake, she used to say, don't scare her off. I didn't scare her off, but I never could quite bring myself to pretend I liked him either. The last real conversation I had with my daughter was 6 months ago, over the phone. She asked me if I was still planning to leave the house to her. I told her I hadn't decided. She got quiet after that, then said something about needing to know for estate planning. I said I'd think about it. We haven't spoken since. Melissa doesn't visit much, and when she does, she comes with Mark. They sweep into my house like a cold front, breezy, disruptive, and never staying long enough for things to settle. They bring takeout food I didn't ask for, rearrange my kitchen drawers, make pointed comments about the dust on the blinds. Mark is always suggesting I get someone in here to help, or maybe downsize to a condo closer to the city. I know what he wants. He wants this house. He wants the land. He thinks I don't see it in the way he inspects the foundation or runs his hand along the porch railing. He thinks I'm a frail old man whose mind is slipping. But my mind is just fine. What's slipping is my patience. I used to dream that Melissa would come to me one day. Just her, no Mark. And we'd talk like we used to, like when she was a girl and would sit at the kitchen table sketching while I graded essays. I'd ask how her day was, and she'd tell me everything. About school, her friends, the horse she wanted but never got. That little girl is gone now, replaced by a woman I barely recognize. One who treats me like a burden, a problem to be managed. Last Christmas, they didn't even send a card. No call. Nothing. I spent the day watching reruns of black and white westerns and wondering what Doris would think of all this. Still, I try to hold on to something. A thread of hope, maybe. I keep Melissa's childhood room exactly the way it was. Pastel wallpaper, a wooden bed frame with a carved star at the headboard, a bookshelf lined with yellowed paperbacks and plastic horses. I dust it every week. I tell myself I'm preserving it for her, in case she ever comes home. But the truth is, I'm preserving it for me. Because if I let that room go, I've really lost her. My finances are modest but stable. I live off a teacher's pension, some savings, and a small inheritance Doris left behind. I've always been frugal. No cable, no new car, no vacations. My truck is a rusted '97 Ford that still runs if I treat it gently. I pay my bills on time, balance my checkbook every Sunday, and never use a debit card online. I don't trust the internet. Mark once laughed at that, said I was living in the Stone Age. But I don't need gadgets to know when someone is lying to me. I can see it in their eyes. I don't have much, but what I have is mine. My name is on the deed to this house. My hands built the shelves in the den, laid the tile in the kitchen, patched the roof after Hurricane Matthew. Every nail, every board has a story. This place is not just property, it's my life. So when the letter from the bank came, a thin white envelope, official-looking, with my full name printed neatly above the address, I opened it without much thought. I assumed it was another offer for a reverse mortgage or some reminder about a paperless billing option I had no intention of activating. But what I read inside stopped my heart cold. According to their records, I had recently applied for a line of credit through a private financial institution based in Florida. The letter thanked me for my business, confirmed the approval of a substantial loan, and listed the item for which the funds had been used. A 52-foot luxury yacht, purchased from a marina in Miami for $482,000, registered under my name, and scheduled for transfer to a private dock the following week. I read the letter 3 times. I called the bank's fraud department. They were polite but cautious. The paperwork matched. Signature, social security number, even copies of my driver's license and utility bills, all valid, all mine. Except I hadn't signed a thing. I hadn't left South Carolina in over a year. I didn't even know how to swim. I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, the letter spread before me like a crime scene, my hands trembling. I thought of Melissa. I thought of Mark. And for the first time in years, I felt something sharp and cold rise up in my chest. Suspicion. And beneath it, a terrible certainty. They had taken more than my silence. They had taken my name. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my recliner, the bank letter on the coffee table in front of me, staring at it as if it might change if I looked long enough. I tried to reason through it, to find some explanation that didn't involve betrayal. Maybe it was a clerical error, a glitch in the system. Maybe someone really had stolen my identity. Some stranger with a criminal background, a hacker from overseas. But as the hours crawled by and the room darkened around me, only one name kept circling back in my mind like a mosquito I couldn't swat. Mark Granger. He'd always had a way of acting like he knew more than everyone else in the room. He worked in business development, whatever that meant, though every time I asked for specifics, he got vague. "It's complicated, Harold," he'd say, chuckling as if I wouldn't understand the grown-up stuff. Once I overheard him telling Melissa they were going to be flush soon, that he had a deal lined up that would take care of everything. I thought he meant a promotion, maybe a new job. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning I went to my filing cabinet, a dented metal box in the guest bedroom, and pulled out every document I had. Bank statements, old tax returns, my will, the deed to the house, even Doris's death certificate. I needed to see it all, to make sure nothing else had been touched. Everything seemed in order, but that only unsettled me more. Whoever did this hadn't needed to rummage through my drawers. They already had what they needed. That afternoon, I drove into town and walked into the sheriff's office. I didn't call ahead, didn't make an appointment. I just showed up, envelope in hand, and asked to speak to someone about a possible identity theft case. The deputy at the desk was polite but distracted, eyes flicking between me and the computer screen behind the counter. He told me to have a seat, that someone would be with me shortly. I waited for 45 minutes before a young officer with a badge that said T. Murphy came out and called my name. We sat in a cramped office with beige walls and a humming fluorescent light. I handed him the letter and explained what had happened, how I'd received it out of nowhere, how I hadn't applied for any loans or purchased any boats, how I hadn't set foot in Florida since the 1980s. Murphy listened, nodding occasionally, and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he tapped the letter with his pen and asked if I had any enemies. I shook my head. "Just a daughter and her husband," I said quietly. "And lately, even they don't return my calls." He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask more. He said they'd look into it, that I should file a report with the Federal Trade Commission and place a freeze on my credit. I did everything he told me. I called the FTC, filled out forms online, spent the next 3 days on the phone with credit agencies, trying to protect what little I had left. Each call ended with the same reassurances. "We'll look into it. We're sorry this happened to you. Thank you for your patience." But nothing changed. The yacht was still registered in my name. The loan was still active. And then, on the 4th day, I received a second letter, this time from a law office in Miami. It confirmed my recent purchase, outlined my ownership responsibilities, and enclosed an invoice for dock maintenance and storage fees totaling over $8,000. That's when the fear turned into something else, into rage. I called Melissa. It went straight to voicemail. I called again, and again. On the 5th try, she picked up. "Daddy," she said, her voice hesitant, almost annoyed. "Everything okay?" I told her about the letters, the bank, the yacht. I asked her point blank if Mark had anything to do with it. There was a pause, long, loaded. Then she said, "Daddy, that's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," I said. "It's a question." She exhaled slowly. "Mark would never do something like that. You're confused." "I'm not confused," I snapped. "Someone used my name, my social security number. Someone forged my signature. If it wasn't you, and it wasn't me, who does that leave?" "I don't know," she said, defensive now. "Maybe you misplaced something. Maybe you clicked on a bad email link. People get scammed all the time." "I don't use email," I said. "And I don't misplace my identity." She got quiet again. I could hear Mark's voice in the background, low and muffled. Then Melissa said, "Look, I can talk to him, okay? But don't go throwing around accusations. You're just stressed. Let's not make this worse." "I'm going to the police," I told her, "and if he's behind this, I'll press charges." There was a pause. Then she hung up. The next day, 2 things happened. First, I got a call from a detective in Miami. He confirmed that the yacht had indeed been delivered, registered, and docked under the name Harold Deansmore. He also informed me that the delivery was signed for in person by someone who presented valid photo ID, a driver's license with my name and address on it. Second, I received a letter from the IRS. According to their records, I had failed to report a large asset acquisition on my previous return. They were requesting clarification. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just theft. It was a noose tightening around my neck. I sat in my living room, papers scattered across the coffee table like fallen leaves, and I realized something with complete, soul-deep certainty. They weren't trying to steal from me. They were trying to erase me. Take my name, take my money, saddle me with debt, maybe even drive me into legal ruin. And then what? Ship me off to some memory care facility and tell the world I'd gone senile? That I couldn't be trusted with my own affairs? Mark had always hinted that I was slipping. He'd say it with a smile like a joke. "You're not getting any younger, Harold. We worry about you out here all by yourself. Have you thought about getting power of attorney just in case?" I used to wave him off, thinking it was just his way of pretending to care. Now I saw it for what it was. Preparation, conditioning, setting the stage for something bigger. I remembered a visit from 6 months ago, just before Christmas. Mark had brought me a folder, said it was insurance paperwork, asked me to sign a few pages while we were watching the game. Just routine stuff, he'd said. I hadn't read it carefully. I'd been distracted, tired, grateful even that someone was paying attention to me. My hand had shaken as I signed. Now I wondered what I'd really agreed to. That night I made 3 copies of every document I had. I mailed 1 set to the Miami detective, 1 to a lawyer I knew from church, and kept 1 for myself. I took photos with my phone, grainy but legible, and backed them up on a USB stick, which I hid in the garage under a loose floorboard. I was 79 years old. I didn't move fast, didn't see well in low light, couldn't hear out of my left ear. But I wasn't stupid, and I wasn't about to let them bury me while I was still breathing. They thought they'd chosen the perfect victim, but they'd forgotten one thing. I had nothing left to lose. The following week crawled forward like a fevered dream. I kept waiting for someone to call me back, someone in authority who would tell me this had all been a mistake, that they'd caught the real thief and I could go back to boiling eggs and watching the marsh change colors with the sky. But no such call came. Instead, the silence became a second skin. The only voices were those in my head, re-examining every encounter, every signature, every moment of weakness I'd allowed Mark to exploit. My lawyer, Mr. Colvin, a quiet man in his 60s with a gray beard and the calm demeanor of a lifelong Methodist, reviewed the documents I'd sent him and called me on a Tuesday afternoon to say he believed I might have a case. But the fraud was intricate. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. "We'll need evidence," he said. "Real evidence. Names, dates, digital trails. Otherwise they'll say you're just an old man confused by paperwork." Confused. That word had started to follow me around like a stray dog. It was the word Melissa had used. The word I heard in the bank teller's careful tone when I'd asked her to flag my accounts. The word Mark used as a weapon wrapped in kindness. I wasn't confused. I was outraged, and that, I discovered, was a far lonelier thing. On Friday, I got a call from the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office. A different voice this time. Older, gruff, Sergeant Langley. He said they were following up on my identity theft complaint and had a few more questions. Would I be willing to come in? I said yes. I wanted to be helpful. I wanted to believe that if I just cooperated enough, showed enough reason and composure, someone would see the truth. That was my first mistake. Langley wasn't unkind, but he wasn't interested in my outrage either. He asked questions in a slow, deliberate cadence that made me feel like a suspect rather than a victim. Had I ever been to Florida? Could I have forgotten a trip? Had I given anyone access to my personal information? Was I on any medication that might affect memory? I answered every question truthfully. I said no, 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 and finally, "Sergeant, if I were 20 years younger, would you be asking me if I was hallucinating my own bank records?" He didn't answer, just scratched something onto his notepad and closed the file. When I returned home, I found an envelope stuck in the storm door. No postage, just my name scribbled in black ink. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in a bold serif font that looked like it came from a corporate office. It read, "Harold, please stop this nonsense before someone gets hurt. You're not thinking clearly. Let it go." There was no signature, no return address. My hand trembled as I held it. The message wasn't threatening in the legal sense, not enough to take to the police. But I knew what it meant. It was Mark. It had to be. He was trying to scare me back into silence. And for a moment, just a moment, it almost worked. But then I remembered Doris. I remembered the way she used to say, "Don't let yourself be erased, Harold. We get erased enough by time. Don't help them do it." I put the letter in a plastic sleeve and tucked it into the back of the folder with the others. I wouldn't let it be the end of anything. The next morning, I called Colvin and told him everything. The letter, the visit to the sheriff's office, the tone, the questions. "They're setting the stage," I said. "I can feel it. They're trying to paint me as senile so they can control the narrative." He sighed through the phone, and for the first time, I heard something like fear in his voice. "We need leverage," he said. "If they want to treat you like you've lost your grip, you need to prove you haven't. Start documenting everything. Every call, every letter, every memory you can corroborate. Build your own case. Because if this goes to court, they'll use your age against you." So I became my own archivist. I started a notebook, spiral-bound, college-ruled. Every day I wrote what happened, what I ate, who I called, what I remembered. I called old friends, teachers I used to work with, even a few former students who had stayed in town. I asked them to write letters attesting to my mental clarity. Some did, others hesitated. "It's not that we don't believe you, Harold," one said gently. "It's just hard to pick a side." Then, a week later, it happened. I was sitting on the porch after breakfast when a white sedan pulled into my driveway. Two men in suits stepped out, one tall and pale with slicked-back hair, the other short and stocky with a clipboard. They walked toward me with the casual authority of people used to being obeyed. "Mr. Deansmore," the tall one said. I nodded. "We're from the Department of Adult Protective Services. We've received a concern from your family regarding possible cognitive decline and financial vulnerability." I stared at them, blinking slowly. "You're here to investigate me?" The short one nodded, glancing at his clipboard. "Just routine, sir. We received a report that you may be the victim of financial abuse and possibly unable to manage your affairs." "From who?" "I'm afraid that's confidential." I stood up slowly. "Number. You don't get to come onto my property and interrogate me based on anonymous lies." They exchanged glances. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, we may have to escalate this to the court." "To the court?" I barked. "You think you're going to have me declared incompetent?" They didn't answer, just handed me a business card and said they'd be in touch. That night, I barely slept. My chest ached. My mind raced. I imagined them coming back with a court order, dragging me out of my house, putting me in some sterile facility where no one knew my name. I'd seen it happen. To neighbors, to friends. The world had a way of turning old people invisible. Now, I knew how quickly that invisibility could be weaponized. I called Melissa the next day. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail. Calm, firm. "I know what you're doing. It won't work. I'm not going anywhere." No response. But 3 days later, I got a certified letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer in Jacksonville, representing Melissa and Mark. It requested that I consider voluntarily assigning durable power of attorney to Melissa for the sake of efficiency and protection. It was drafted in polite legalese, but the message was clear. Hand over control, or we'll take it from you. I sat at the table holding the letter, my tea going cold beside me, and I realized something that chilled me to the bone. They had already made the decision. In their minds, I was done. A senile old man to be managed, manipulated, discarded. All that was left was the paperwork. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The heat that day was unbearable, thick and pressing like a damp wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders. I had spent the morning going over every bank statement from the past 2 years, cross-referencing transactions, highlighting anything I didn't recognize. There weren't many anomalies. Mark was too clever for that. But I noticed a series of small, consistent digital withdrawals from an account I'd forgotten I even had. An old mutual savings account I'd opened when Melissa was in college, one she had access to for emergencies. Over the last 6 months, nearly $15,000 had disappeared in irregular intervals. I never gave permission for that. I hadn't even looked at the account in years. The betrayal deepened with every line I read until it was no longer a question of doubt. It was arithmetic. Proof. By noon, the house was too hot to think. The AC had gone out the week before, and I couldn't afford to have it repaired until my next pension deposit. I poured a glass of water and sat by the screen door in the back, where at least a thin breeze sometimes stirred the curtain. That's when the phone rang. It was Sergeant Langley again. He asked if I could come in, said there'd been a development in my case. For a moment, hope sparked inside me. Maybe they'd found evidence of fraud. Maybe they had proof, finally, that I was the victim, not the perpetrator. I drove into town in a daze, heart fluttering between dread and anticipation. Langley met me at the front of the station, this time with another officer in tow. I followed them down a hallway into a dimly lit office with no windows. The atmosphere shifted the moment the door closed behind me. Langley asked me to sit, and when I did, he placed a folder on the desk between us. "Mr. Deansmore," he began, "we've received reports and supporting documents indicating that you applied for and approved financing for a high-value maritime vehicle under your name. We have a signature match, a photo ID, and verified transactions." I stared at him. "I told you already. I didn't sign anything." "I understand," he said flatly, "but I need you to know that based on the evidence submitted, the state of Florida has issued a warrant for questioning. You're not under arrest," he added quickly, "but we do need you to remain available for further investigation." My mouth went dry. "You think I did this? You think I bought a yacht?" Langley looked uncomfortable, but didn't deny it. The other officer, a younger man with a skeptical expression and arms crossed too tightly, shifted his weight, clearly waiting for a confession that wasn't coming. "I'm 79 years old," I said. "I don't even have a passport. I haven't traveled farther than Charleston in a decade. Why would I need a damn yacht?" "That's what we're trying to understand, sir." "No," I said, standing. "That's what I'm trying to get you to understand. I've been set up. Someone forged my signature. Someone used a fake ID. And I know exactly who." They asked me to calm down, to sit, but I refused. I said what I'd held back for weeks, that my daughter's husband had access to my papers, that he'd manipulated me into signing things without reading them, that he'd made snide comments about my memory, tried to push power of attorney. That Melissa had gone along with it, turning a blind eye or worse. Langley listened, his expression unreadable. When I finally ran out of breath, he nodded slowly. "We'll take your statement, but I need you to understand that without direct evidence, digital logs, surveillance, email trails, it's going to be your word against theirs, and they've already submitted several affidavits attesting to your declining faculties." That word again, declining. I went home, shaking. My hands wouldn't grip the steering wheel properly, and I had to pull over halfway there just to catch my breath. I sat on the shoulder of the road, head pressed against the wheel, and I thought about calling Melissa, not to beg, not to yell, just to ask why. Why she'd chosen this path. Why she'd allowed the man she married to devour the father who raised her. But I didn't call. I couldn't. There was no answer in her that wouldn't hurt more. Instead, I called Colvin. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time before speaking. "Harold, I think it's time we stop playing defense." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we go on offense. If they're trying to paint you as mentally incompetent, we get ahead of them. You undergo a full psychological and cognitive evaluation, voluntarily, from a third-party specialist. That way, if they try to use their affidavits in court, we can hit them back with verified medical proof that you're of sound mind." "And if I fail?" I asked, suddenly afraid. "You won't," he said firmly. "I've known you for 15 years. You're more lucid than most people half your age." So that's what I did. I spent the next week undergoing evaluations, neurological, psychiatric, even physical. I answered questions for hours, repeated sequences backward, drew shapes from memory, recited word lists, told stories. At the end of it all, I sat across from a middle-aged doctor with sharp eyes and a clipboard. Mr. Deansmore, she said, I see no reason to question your mental capacity. You're articulate, observant, and cognitively stable. I'll issue the report in writing. You'll have it by Monday. When I stepped out of her office into the late afternoon light, I didn't feel relief. I felt cold clarity. Because now I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't the one falling apart. And that meant they were. The people I'd loved, trusted, were gambling everything on a lie. And now I had the tools to pull the whole damn thing down. The official medical report arrived on Monday afternoon, printed on crisp letterhead and signed by 3 specialists, each attesting in unemotional clinical language that I was of sound mind, cognitively stable, and legally competent to manage my affairs. I held the document in my hands like a shield forged in fire, not just paper but evidence, objective, undeniable, final. It was the first real weapon I had, and I intended to use it. I made 3 certified copies, filed one with Colvin, stored one in a lockbox in my closet, and tucked the third into the inside pocket of my jacket. I began carrying it with me everywhere, like a passport back into a life that had been quietly revoked without my consent. That same evening, Colvin filed a formal response to the letter Melissa's lawyer had sent, the one requesting I consider assigning power of attorney for my own protection. We attached the evaluation. In legal language as dry as sand, we made clear that not only was I competent, but that any further attempts to interfere with my autonomy could be construed as harassment and coercion. It was a warning shot, and for a few days the silence returned. No calls, no letters, just heat and humming fans and the occasional noise from a raccoon rooting through the garbage. But I knew better than to trust quiet in a war like this. The calm was always just the lungful before the next blow. It came on a Thursday morning. I had just returned from the pharmacy where the clerk, bless her, had given me a discount after hearing my name. "My dad had you in 11th grade," she said. "He still talks about the Supreme Court unit you taught." That memory should have warmed me, but I barely had time to process it. Because when I opened the mailbox, there was another letter. This one from the Florida State Tax Authority. According to their system, I was under investigation for failing to declare a high-value asset purchase, a yacht, and for allegedly using it for commercial gain without proper licensing. In other words, they believed I was running some kind of business off that boat. I stood at the edge of the road reading the letter twice, then 3 times, my pulse thudding in my ears. This wasn't just financial theft anymore. This was tax fraud. Federal. I went inside, faxed the letter to Colvin, and poured myself a drink I hadn't touched in years. Doris would have scolded me for that, but I needed something to dull the edges of the fear climbing into my throat. An hour later, Colvin called. "They're escalating," he said. "This isn't just a con anymore. They're burning the house down." I asked him what we could do, and his voice shifted in tone. Less lawyer now, more friend. "We open everything, every account, every deed. We find out exactly how deep this goes." So that's what we did. Over the course of the next 10 days, we dug through layers I didn't know existed. The stolen funds from my dormant savings account were just the beginning. Mark had used my name to apply for multiple lines of credit from private lenders in states I'd never set foot in. Small loans, each just under reporting thresholds designed to fly under the radar. He had routed the funds through shell accounts before using them for expenses that had nothing to do with me. Luxury car rentals, designer electronics, even a temporary lease on a penthouse condo in Miami, all paid under the guise of consulting, business development. But what shook me most was what Colvin discovered about the house. My house. The deed, which I thought had been unaltered since Doris passed, had been modified 6 months earlier. I had been removed as sole owner. In my place, a joint ownership agreement had been filed, adding Melissa as co-owner with survivorship rights. I stared at the scan Colvin sent me, mouth dry. "That can't be right," I said. "I never signed anything." But the signature was there. Mine. Or something that looked like it. "It's forged," I said. "It has to be." "We'll have to prove that," Colvin said. "Forensic handwriting analysis, possibly a criminal investigation." He paused. "But if that deed stands, and you were to pass away—" "Melissa would own everything," I finished. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table until the light outside had shifted from gold to gray. I thought about the Thanksgiving when Melissa was 10 and drew a handprint turkey for the centerpiece. I thought about the night she stood in my bedroom doorway after Doris's funeral, asking if I was okay, and I told her I'd never be okay again. I thought about the time I helped her move into her dorm, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs in the August heat, and how she hugged me tighter than she had since she was a little girl. I remembered all of it, and none of it made sense anymore. The next morning, I went to the bank. I asked to speak to a manager. I sat across from a young man in a navy suit with perfect hair and a nameplate that read J. Patterson. I explained the situation. I showed him the evaluations, the stolen account records, the forged deed. I asked to see every account where Melissa had any shared access. He pulled up the records and clicked around with furrowed brows. "There is one joint account, sir," he said, "created in 2003. You're both listed as equal owners." "Close it," I said. He hesitated. "There's currently a balance of $22,000. Transfer it to my name only, then close it. I'll need your daughter's consent for that. You won't get it. Do it anyway. And if she sues, I'll sue back, and I'll win." I think something in my voice, perhaps the steadiness of it, made him nervous. He nodded slowly. "I'll escalate it to our legal department." "You do that," I said, and walked out before he could say another word. That afternoon, I changed my phone number. I got a new email address. I forwarded all financial correspondence to Colvin's office. I called the DMV and initiated a fraud investigation on the forged driver's license Mark had used in Florida. I sent copies of every forged document to the Miami detective, who by now knew me by name. And then, with my last ounce of emotional energy, I packed a suitcase and drove to Savannah, where I checked into a modest hotel under a different name. I needed time, space, clarity. But more than that, I needed to disappear, just long enough to watch what they'd do when they couldn't track me anymore. 2 days passed. No calls, no messages. Then, on the 3rd day, Colvin called. "They filed a motion," he said. "They're petitioning the court to have you placed under emergency conservatorship. Melissa's claiming you're missing and possibly a danger to yourself. She wants immediate control of your medical and financial decisions." "How is that even legal?" I asked. "You're not missing. You're hiding. There's a difference. But they're betting on time. If the court grants temporary conservatorship, she could access everything before we stop it." "What do we do?" "We stop hiding. You come home. You show up in court. You bring the doctors, the records, the forged signatures. We expose everything." I drove back that night. As I crossed the state line, I realized I hadn't felt this alert in years. The rage that had once exhausted me now powered me forward. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a witness, a plaintiff. A man with a case. They had thrown every tool at their disposal into burying me. Gaslighting, manipulation, legal deceit. And I had risen. The final move was mine, and I intended to make it count. The day of the court hearing arrived under an unusually cold sky for South Carolina, the kind of gray lid that seemed to press down on the earth and the shoulders of anyone walking beneath it. I had slept little the night before, pacing from room to room, unable to quiet my thoughts. I had rehearsed every word I might say, every detail of every document, every humiliating memory I'd been forced to endure over the past months, each one a brick in the wall I intended to build between myself and the lie Melissa and Mark were trying to enshrine as truth. I wore a dark navy suit, freshly pressed, and the tie Doris had once bought for our anniversary, a small gesture of continuity I felt I needed. I arrived at the courthouse an hour early and waited in the corridor outside the chamber, listening to the buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of heels clicking across the tile. Colvin arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather case and nodding toward me with the solemnity of someone preparing for battle. "They've filed their claim in full," he said. "They're asking for immediate conservatorship based on mental decline and suspected self-harm. They've submitted statements from neighbors, bank representatives, and of course their own affidavit." I nodded, saying nothing, though a burning rose in my chest that I refused to let show. We were summoned 10 minutes later by a bailiff who looked barely older than my grandson. The courtroom was not crowded, but felt full. Melissa sat at one table wearing a beige blazer and clasping a leather-bound folder to her chest like it might protect her from what was coming. Mark sat beside her, arms folded, his mouth curled in a look that bordered on smugness. He didn't look at me. Or perhaps he did, but I refused to see it. The judge, a woman in her 50s with the wary eyes of someone long since disillusioned by people, called the session to order and invited their lawyer to present. He rose with a practiced grace and began speaking in a tone both paternal and righteous. He described an elderly man in visible cognitive decline, someone whose financial records were erratic, whose behavior had become increasingly suspicious, who had voluntarily fled his residence and gone missing for several days. He made repeated references to my age, my reported confusion, and most galling of all, my paranoid claims about identity theft, implying not just that I was mistaken, but that I had fabricated an entire conspiracy to avoid family oversight. I sat in silence as he spoke, staring at the grain in the table before me, my hands folded together. The rage I had felt for months simmered just below the surface, but I kept it there, not out of weakness but because I knew the moment I opened my mouth, it had to matter. Colvin stood when our turn came, and his voice, though quieter, carried more weight. He presented my medical evaluation first, signed and certified by 3 independent specialists. He reminded the court that I had voluntarily submitted to these tests, had passed them unequivocally, and had done so without the prompting of any legal challenge. He then presented the documents, bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals, forged loan applications, the yacht registration under my name, the altered deed Melissa had filed without my knowledge. When the forged signature was projected onto the screen, and mine beside it, even the judge leaned forward. "We have retained a handwriting analyst," Colvin said. "His findings are included in the documents you've been given. The signature is not only forged, it was copied from a 2016 tax return." He paused, letting the silence land with force. Then, finally, I was called to the stand. I rose slowly, not for show, but because my knees truly did ache from the cold, and walked to the witness seat. The bailiff asked me to swear in, and I did, my voice clear. As I sat, I looked not at the judge but at Melissa, who now kept her eyes fixed on the folder in her lap. I began to speak, not quickly, not forcefully, but with the cadence of someone who had nothing left to hide. I told the court about my life after Doris's death, about the long days alone, the few joys I had left. I spoke of Melissa's gradual absence, of Mark's slick charm and the growing discomfort I had felt around him. I described how I had signed papers I hadn't read, not out of carelessness but out of trust, because when your family asks you for help, you don't imagine that help will become a noose. I detailed the discovery of the stolen accounts, the forged applications, the letter from the marina about the yacht I had never seen. I admitted to hiding for a few days in Savannah, not to escape reality, but to protect myself from the people who had turned my reality into something I could no longer recognize. I ended not with accusation, but with a question, one I directed straight at my daughter. "If I am so incapable," I said, "why did you need to forge my name? If I'm too confused to manage my own money, why was I able to track every dollar you took? There was no answer. The judge called a short recess. I returned to my seat, hands trembling now from exhaustion. When the court reconvened, her ruling came swiftly and without ambiguity. The petition for conservatorship was denied. The court found no evidence of mental incompetence, and the medical evaluations were upheld as valid. Furthermore, the matter of the forged documents and financial fraud would be referred to a separate civil proceeding, with the potential for criminal charges depending on the outcome of forensic investigation. Melissa looked pale. Mark looked angry. The judge dismissed the session. I left the courthouse feeling not victorious, but empty. It had taken everything in me to stand there, to make myself vulnerable, to admit to being tricked by the people I had loved most. But what I felt most of all was relief, not because I had won, but because I had been believed. In a world that had tried so hard to silence me, that alone felt like a miracle. In the weeks following the court ruling, I found myself walking through my own home like a man returned to a country he no longer fully recognized. The walls were the same, the furniture in its familiar places, the creaking of the floorboards as consistent as ever, but something in the air had changed. It wasn't just the knowledge that I had survived an attack from within my own family. It was the awareness that something fundamental had broken, and no ruling, no judge's decree could stitch it back together. Melissa didn't call. There were no apologies, no letters, no explanations. Only a cold and deliberate silence, as if by losing in court she had decided I no longer existed. Mark disappeared entirely from the picture, whether by fear of prosecution or by the unraveling of his own schemes, I never found out. Colvin informed me that an investigation had been opened by the Florida authorities into the financial misconduct, and that the yacht had been seized as evidence. There was a possibility that Mark could face criminal charges for fraud, identity theft, and forgery. But the wheels of justice turn slowly, and I had already learned not to expect them to repair what had been taken. I began making changes. I updated my will to exclude Melissa entirely, and instead left everything, my house, my remaining savings, even Doris's old jewelry, to a charitable foundation for underprivileged students who wanted to study history. It felt right. I began donating items, books, and furniture to the local community center, choosing to shed the weight of the past rather than let it rot around me. I canceled shared accounts, cut all legal ties, and moved my banking to a small credit union in town where the tellers knew me by name. I also hired a young man from the church to help with errands and minor repairs, not because I couldn't do them, but because I wanted to feel, for once, that someone was entering my life without an angle. And then, one morning, I found something unexpected in the mail. A postcard. No return address, no signature. Just a picture of a lighthouse on the front and on the back, in handwriting I knew instantly as Melissa's. You chose your pride. I hope it keeps you warm. I stared at it for a long time, not out of sadness but from the sheer smallness of the message. I had expected rage, remorse, or even shame. But what I received instead was a child's spite disguised as principle. I burned the card that evening in the fireplace, watching the edges curl and disappear into smoke. That was the last word between us. I began writing, not memoirs exactly, but reflections. I took out a stack of lined notebooks and filled them with memories of Doris, of teaching, of the marsh behind the house and how it looked in late September when the light cut through the reeds just so. I wrote about the trial, about the betrayal, but I wrote it not to publish, not to prove anything but to remember myself, to remind the man I had once been that he was still alive, still lucid, and still worthy of being heard. Some evenings I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and think about all that's past. I don't feel peace exactly. That's a word for people who've forgotten too much. But I do feel clarity. I understand now that being old doesn't mean being helpless, that dignity is not something others give you. It's something you claim, sometimes at great cost. I also understand that love, no matter how deep, cannot excuse cruelty. Blood may tie us to people, but it does not bind our loyalty. That must be earned, and it can be lost. They tried to take everything from me, my name, my home, my freedom. In the end, I kept the one thing that mattered. I kept the truth, and I intend to carry it with me, for however many years I have left. Not as a wound, but as a warning,